Hello and welcome to Topic 5, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at categories of law. All right, so in this lecture, we are going to be learning about the categories of law, in particular, the difference between criminal and civil law. Now, your textbook also talks about the ways that different crimes are classified, in particular, the difference between misdemeanors and felonies. So, we're not going to cover that in lecture, but I want to make sure to draw your attention to that so that you cover that in the textbook. All right, that's what we've got on the docket. So, let's go ahead and get started. So, in modern America, laws govern many aspects of our lives. And if you just sort of think about like your day to day, okay, think about what you've done up to this point in the day, or that what you're listening to this lecture. Ask yourself, did you, when you woke up, what did you eat for breakfast? When you drove to campus, maybe you needed to fill up the gas tank, so it costs certain money. Let's say you're at one of the branch campuses taking some face-to-face classes, right? You walk onto the campus, okay? When you think about your day in and day out life, you might not realize it, but laws have a tremendous impact on our aspects of our lives. What you ate for breakfast and the cost of that has to do with laws, in particular, trade laws, right? And so that we have trade treaties between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and that can impact the availability of fruits and vegetables that you might eat for breakfast. We have tax laws so that when you go and you fill up your tank of gas, you're going to be paying more or less depending on what the laws in your state are regarding the taxation of fossil fuel. If you go to campus, right, particularly any of the campuses within UWM, right? If you go to the branch campus, there are laws governing the county's responsibility for uptake and care of the branch campus. If you are paying for tuition and you get assistance from the government, that's a reflection of certain laws that we have in place, whether those are laws that confer grants or laws that confer loans to go to college. So, when you really think about our day in, day out lives, that much of our lives are governed by law. So obviously the commerce and the economy, right? That the amount of money you get paid, a minimum wage, right? That's determined by both federal and state law. What you can and cannot buy. I know in Wisconsin, a lot of people want to eat milk that has not been pasteurized, right? That is just sort of the fresh milk that comes out of cows, raw milk. But that's illegal. You can't do that or sell that in certain capacities within Wisconsin. Law controls and has impact on your private relationships. If you're a parent, you have a legal obligation to take care of your kids. And if you fail to do that, there is a consequence for doing that. As you know from last week, I'm married, my husband Mike, and so that there are certain, through law, there are certain obligations that we have to each other, and there's certain tax benefits that we get. And heaven forbid, if we were ever to get divorce, we would have to go to court and follow the laws regarding the dissolution of a marriage. It controls not only private relationships, but law impacts our relationship between individuals and the government, right? The government basically tells us what we can and cannot do in many ways, right? I mean, in some ways that there are no laws regarding certain sorts of behaviors, so you're free to engage in those sorts of laws. There's certain laws regarding that prohibit certain kinds of behaviors, criminal laws, and so that you could engage in that behavior, but there's going to be a consequence for that. Okay, and so law plays a really big, important part of our life. And even though we might feel like the laws, they're constraining me, it's really better than the contrary, right? That we could govern people's how much money they make. We could govern their private relationships. We could govern our relationships between individuals and other individuals within society based on force, right? Whoever has the most power is the one who gets to dictate how much you get paid, the brute force dictates certain relationships to others. But we have a law, and then we have a respect for the rule of law. We want to follow the rule of law. And so that leads us to that quote at the top with President John F. Kennedy saying, certain other societies may respect the rule of force, brute force, those who have brute power, but we respect the rule of law. So even though our lives are, that many aspects of our life are controlled by the law, that also means that we follow the rule of law. And that means that those who are trying to do things just out of brute force, that in theory, they are prohibited from doing that because everybody must follow the law. So there are many different categories of law, but we're going to be focusing on two categories of law: criminal law and civil law. So let's start with criminal law. What is criminal law? And obviously this chapter that we're reading deals with criminal law because this is a class on criminal justice. But it's important to know the difference between criminal and civil law and also where they overlap at times. So criminal law, as it states there, is the body of rules that define what a crime is, set out their punishments, and mandate the procedures for carrying out the criminal justice process. Okay. So we're going to break that apart in a little bit, but basically that is the way that criminal law is defined. Defining crimes, the law that tells us what the punishment is, and then the laws that tell us what the procedures are for administering that law. Now, civil law is basically all law that isn't criminal. Okay. And we're going to go into this in more detail in a moment. And so civil law it's a set of rules outlining how to deal with disputes that arise between private individuals or organizations. Okay. And so criminal law is about the government versus the individual, usually. Civil law is law that governs the relationships between individuals. So let's look at each of these categories of laws in more detail so that we get a better understanding of what these definitions mean. So as we were looking at the definition for criminal law, we saw that criminal law was basically divided up into two main branches. One aspect of criminal law is what is known as substantive criminal law. And it's called substantive criminal law because it's basically telling us what the substance of the crime is, okay? So in this branch, in substantive criminal law, this is the branch of law that defines crimes and what their punishment is, okay? And so that seems pretty simple, but it's really kind of not, okay? And so that when you look at, like, for example, Wisconsin statutes, okay, that for every criminal offense, it actually gives us a definition of what that crime is, right? So it's sort of like if you engage in this behavior, then the prosecutor has to prove that that behavior matches this classification and this definition of crime as it's laid out in the criminal statute, right? And so, for example, that if somebody is charged with armed burglary, right, that there's certain elements of the crime that you have to, like, prove because those elements of the crime are defined in state statute, right? So it really tells us, like, what armed burglary is, or what armed robbery is, or what, rape is. That's going to be defined in state statute, and that's a part of substantive criminal law. It also will tell us that the category or the classification of that crime. Is it a serious crime, a felony, or is it a less serious crime, misdemeanor? And then even if it is a felony or a misdemeanor, it'll get a classification within that category, right? And so in Wisconsin, the most serious felonies are Class A felonies, and the most least serious felonies, although it's still a felony, is a Class I. And then it also tells us what the punishment's going to be. So for example, in Wisconsin, if you are convicted of a Class C felony, then we look at substantive criminal law in Wisconsin, and it tells us that the maximum punishment for that is 25 years in prison, okay? So that's what substantive criminal law is. On the other branch of criminal law is what's known as procedural criminal law. And what procedural criminal law is, it's the law that basically sets out the basic rules of practice in the criminal justice system. And so that is also established in law. So, for example, that there are laws governing how people can be arrested. There are laws regarding when you are going to first appear in court, right? There are laws regarding the right to a criminal defense attorney. There are laws regarding how many people are going to sit on the jury. Okay. There are laws regarding how many appeals you get. Okay. So all of those are examples of those basic rules of practice in the criminal justice system. And those are all defined in procedural criminal law. All right, here is your opportunity to test your knowledge of the difference between substantive criminal law and procedural criminal law. Okay, so is classifying aggravated assault as a felony? Is that an example of substantive criminal law or procedural criminal law? Well, if you answered substantive, that is correct, because obviously it is classifying. It's telling us what kind of classification aggravated assault is, and in this case, it is a felony. So it's defining crime. A person found guilty by a jury has a right to one appeal. Is that substantive or procedural criminal law? If you answered procedural, you are correct, because it's basically telling us the procedures that are associated with the criminal justice process. All persons charged with a crime that could result in incarceration have a right to counsel. Is it substantive or procedural? It is procedural. I feel like I gave all the answers in the previous slide, because again, it's telling us about the process. The punishment for auto theft is 20 to 36 months. Is that substantive or procedural? It's substantive because it's defining what the possible range of punishment is. All right, how about this one? A person failed to pay his rent for 3 months and is being evicted from their apartment. Is that substantive criminal law or procedural criminal law? Well, let's think about that for a little bit. This is a trick question. It is neither. It is not an example of criminal law, but it is an example of civil law, which gives us this great segue into talking about, well, gosh darn it, what is civil law? All right, so that brings us to civil law. And just to refresh your memory, that civil law is defined as a set of rules outlining how to deal with disputes that arise between private individuals and organizations. So it could be a dispute between an individual versus an individual. It could be a dispute between a private individual and a private organization, like a corporation. It could also be a suit between a private organization and another private organization. Okay, all of those could be possible disputes that are dealt with via civil law. Civil law also deals with a failure to carry out a legal duty. Okay, so let's look at the different types of civil disputes that are covered within civil law, and also some of the ways in which civil law disputes, how that they are resolved. Okay, so one type of civil dispute is the dispute over a breach of contract. And so in that previous slide, when I asked you if when a person is fails to pay their rent and then they're evicted from their apartment, is that a criminal or civil offense? Or in that case, I was like, was it substantive criminal law or procedural criminal law? And I said neither, it's civil law. That's because that's a contractual relationship between two people, right? That so when we talk about sorts of civil disputes, it's when you have two people who sign a contract, right? In the case, this would be the landlord and the tenant, and that each side agrees to abide by that contract, right? The tenant agrees to pay the rent, then the landlord agrees to, give the service, right? Provide a livable space, right? And then if there's a breach of that contract, then a dispute arises, right? So if a person fails to pay their rent, then the landlord would say, hey, you're not living up to your end of the contract, and so I'm going to sue you for not doing that. But the tenant could say, look, the reason I'm not paying my my rent is because you are not providing me with a livable space. There's no heat, there are rats everywhere, whatever, right? And so that's just one example of civil law revolves around contract, and a civil dispute would be a breach of contract, right? And so that could, a breach of contract could be between a tenant and their and the landlord. Breach of contract could be that you hire somebody to do landscaping around your house, right? A breach of contract is a marriage. A marriage is a legal contract, okay? And then if there's a breach of that, either somebody cheats or irreconcilable differences, and then so there's a breach of this marital contract. That's one type of civil dispute. Another type of civil dispute would be an invasion of privacy. Okay, and so there are civil laws that tell us what certain things need to be kept private. And so, for example, y'all are students, okay? And so that when it comes to, students, there are federal laws regarding the privacy of students, okay? And so if I get personal information about a student for some reason, I can't share that information because I'm violating civil law, because I'm invading the student's privacy. Same with medical HIPAA, right, requirements, that medical information is private and cannot be shared without the person's approval. Okay, and so that's just an example of an invasion of privacy that it falls under civil law. You hire somebody to manage your finances, the breach of fiduciary responsibility. And so if they're investing your money and they're doing it to make themselves money and not you money, or they're not doing it properly, that could be is governed by civil law. And that breach of that fiduciary responsibility is a dispute that could arise. Negligence, failure to exercise care, right? And so that, like I said, that you could be hired to engage in a certain care, right? I hire somebody and they're going to take care of my dog and they fail to do it. They're negligent, right? That negligence among parents, that if you engage in behavior that failures to exercise care, that it's a civil matter, but it can also be a criminal matter. So in a second that we'll see where these overlap. Just in the news recently with that heavy snow that we had, all that snow piled up at Bayshore Mall in Glendale in the middle, and the parking garage collapsed, right? That's an example of negligence, and it's likely that snow removal company will be sued by the owners of Bayshore Mall. A slander, liable, that is knowingly saying false things in order to harm a person's character. All of those are examples of civil law and kinds of civil disputes that could arise out of civil law. Now, I want you to keep in mind that when it comes to how you resolve these disputes, there are no criminal sanctions, okay? So if you fail to pay your rent and then your landlord sues you, you'll go to civil court, and then a judge or a jury will determine who is the responsible party, okay? And who's ever found to be the responsible party, they are not going to be sent to jail. They are going to be asked to do something that a sanction will be placed upon them that is not a criminal sanction. And so that that you could say that you could be forced to pay damages, right? And so let's say that you didn't pay your rent. That's because the landlord didn't provide a livable space. Well, then the landlord might need to pay their tenant, right, for any lost job hours or like lost items in their home, frozen plants that they had or whatever, because they didn't have heat, being bit by a rat, right? The landlord might be, if found to be the responsible party, might have to pay for the damages. If you hire somebody to do work for you and they fail to do it, a civil resolution could be, you're the responsible party, you're the one who broke the contract, you need to hold up your end of that contract and complete the contract. So just keep in mind that, you could also be asked to pay a fine for damages and those sorts of things. Well, that's the first one. And so keep in mind that when it comes to civil law, there are no criminal sanctions. You cannot be put in jail. You don't lose your liberty. You cannot be incarcerated. However, that you could be forced to, pay a fine or a fee directly to the individual that has been harmed. Okay, so at this point, you might be like, Professor Hankinson, Why are we learning about civil law? This is a class on criminal justice, about criminal law. Well, my fine scholars, the reason that we're learning about it is because, as it says there, civil law is related to criminal law, and that oftentimes civil law deals with personal injury, or what is known as tort law. And so that oftentimes we have an overlap between criminal law and civil law, particularly if somebody is physically harmed by the actions of another person. And so keep in mind that a person can be charged by the state with a crime. Okay, so keep in mind criminal law is individual versus the state. Okay, a crime is a public action, but they could also be sued for personal injury. So if, for example, if I injure somebody in terms of like a car accident, I could be sued by that individual in civil court, but I could also be charged with the crime for like reckless driving or driving while intoxicated and harming somebody, right? And so you have that overlapping. Now, keep in mind, this is not a violation of the Fifth Amendment double jeopardy clause, okay? Because you are not being tried twice. Double jeopardy applies to criminal law. If you are charged with a crime and then you are sued by an individual, that doesn't implicate the double jeopardy clause of the Fifth Amendment. Perfect example of the overlap between personal injury and criminal law is O.J. Simpson, okay? And so O.J. Simpson, we all know this, that there was a criminal case. It was the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson for killing. He was charged with murder, the murder of his wife, okay? And as we all know in that criminal trial, that Orenthal James Simpson, O.J. Simpson, was found to be not guilty in the criminal trial, right? If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. He was found not guilty. And keep in mind that the standard used in a criminal trial is a really high standard. That to find somebody guilty, you have to be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's, important. You want to have a high evidentiary standard for criminal law. Why? Because your liberty can be taken away. Your life can be taken away, right? It could be subject to the death penalty. But as we also know that O.J. Simpson was sued by a wrongful death suit was pursued by Nicole Simpson's parents. Okay, they basically sued O.J. Simpson for engaging in a wrongful death, and so it was the parents who were basically suing O.J. for wrongful death, and he was found responsible for the wrongful death of Nicole Simpson, okay? And as we know, he was, for one, the evidentiary standard is lower in a civil case. It is by the preponderance of the evidence, so that when you look at the most of the evidence, do you feel as if that O.J. Simpson was responsible for a wrongful death? And also, as we know, that even though he was found responsible, that he didn't lose life or liberty, but that he was ordered to pay damages to Nicole Brown's family, and Nicole Simpson's family. And that's why he ended up selling his memorabilia in order to, get funds in order to meet the damages that he was ordered by the court to pay. Okay, so this is a really good example of that overlap between criminal and civil law. I want to draw your attention to a really great graphic in your textbook that basically does a comparison of criminal law and tort law, okay? And so it's in the chapter 4, the concept summary for 1. We're not going to go over this in lecture just to save time, but make sure that you look at this because it really tells us the ways in which criminal and civil law are similar and the ways that they are different. So make sure you take a look at that. All right, here is your opportunity to apply what you've learned in this lecture. Okay, so is this primarily a civil or a criminal matter? Marriage and divorce. The answer is civil. How about copyright violation? Is it primarily civil or criminal? It's actually both, okay? That there are laws, criminal laws regarding copyright violation, and then there is also civil laws regarding suing somebody for taking your intellectual property. Car accident, as I mentioned, that depends on the situation. It can definitely be both, and so you could be sued for personal injury, but if you violate some criminal law regarding the use of a vehicle, that you could be charged by the state with a crime. Identity theft, both, that you can sue somebody for taking your identity, but there are criminal laws prohibiting identity. Denied unemployment. Let's say that you lose your job and then you go into the unemployment board and you file papers to get unemployment and you're denied. That's a civil matter, okay? And so that would be a dispute between you and the state, right? An organization within the state. So you'd be suing the state of Wisconsin for wrongfully denying you benefits. That would be a civil matter. How about a confession beaten out of a person in police custody? That's both, okay? And so that that is against federal civil rights law if cops beat people on duty and even off duty, I think, and if they're in the capacity of some sort of law enforcement action. And then also you could sue the police, as we know people do, for engaging in that kind of wrongful personal harm. Okay, that's it from me for this lecture. I hope you have a better understanding of the difference between civil and criminal law. In the next lecture, we're going to dig into criminal law, in particular, looking at the elements of a crime. Thanks for paying attention. I really appreciate it, and I talk to you again soon.